Sorry, it's me. Can you guys see that? Guys, can someone just let me know that you can see it? Someone unmute.
Yeah, we can see it.
Perfect, thank you. Okay. So the Black Lives Matter movement was actually founded in 2013. It wasn't something that began in 2020. It's a movement that's been around for a considerable amount of time. And it's one of many movements that are working towards racial justice. It was a response to racist violence, particularly police oppression against Americans of color. So African Americans really bore the brunt of police aggression in a way that they experience the police service in America in a much different way than a white person would experience police services. And I just want to share with you some anecdotal evidence. And the reason that I'm able to do this is because the Center for Civil Society during the lockdown had a special seminar series called hashtag Black Lives Matter, where we had guest speakers from a lot of our American colleagues presented webinars on their experiences of Black Lives Matter and the protests and the developments in the States. We also had a Canadian during that time. So this is a really excellent resource for you to go and listen to some of those webinars to think about your themes for your op-ed. And I was very moved by some of the experiences that colleagues shared. So Maria Martin, for example, who's a well-known Black female academic, you know, she was sharing how Black people are really terrorized by the police. You know, she said she was driving along or she was getting into her car, and you can go and listen to the webinar. It's recorded. It's on the UCCS YouTube channel. You can go and listen. I mean, she puts it much better than I. And she said that this cop just gave her a look and she knew immediately that he was going to make her life difficult. It was just a look. It was nothing more than a look. And it was only because she was Black. So this is the sort of oppressive environment in which Black people in the States exist under, right? So this sort of reaction to police oppression towards African Americans is one of the reasons for Black Lives Matter and many other movements working for racial justice, movements that are also working for the abolition of police, which means different things. So, you know, there's, yeah, so, okay, we'll talk about this a little bit when I go into that particular theme. So it was a response to violence, racial injustice, police oppression, police brutality, and it appealed to activists across the board, right? Grassroots activists, grassroots organizers. It appealed to people in multiple communities, some who directly experience this racial violence, and some who are beginning to understand how systems work against people of color and people who are not comfortable with that. Okay, so in the case of the last few months, there are people that have been aware of this for a very long time, but it certainly seems that during the lockdown and during the pandemic, there was a different sort of a reaction from various communities, not just from Black communities or organizations that have been working towards racial violence, against racial violence for decades, right? They definitely seem to be a new element in what happened in 2020. And we're going to talk more about that just now. So the hashtag BLM used disruptive techniques to draw attention to its cause, marches, rallies, occupations. So very much making themselves heard, making themselves known, making themselves seen. standing up against oppression. So in 2020, during the COVID-19 pandemic, Black Lives Matter exploded onto the scene. Protesters braved lockdown regulations and state retaliation and like further state oppression. They came out in their numbers to oppose police brutality and injustice against Black people. So why was this? Why did this happen during 2020, during the pandemic? So this is something that we can understand through this theory, political opportunities. Why did it happen now? Like, why did it happen? You'd think that during the pandemic, the last thing people want to do is to go out and protest. You want to stay at home and be safe. Don't want to have to go out and worry about wearing a mask or social distance protesting. Protesting in itself is quite an event. To have to apply social distance tactics just makes things all the more difficult, right? Why not just wait when things have settled down and then go and do your protest, right? So in social movement theory, this refers to political opportunities or the broader set of political constraints or opportunities that are in that current context. So during 2020 in the US, there were two trends that could have fueled the BLM in terms of its political opportunities. The first was the Donald Trump presidency. So his presidency radicalized thousands of white Americans who were previously inclined to dismiss systemic racism as a myth, right? Lots of people who are saying, oh, there's no racism anymore. You know, there are lots of people who do believe that. The minute that you don't have racist legislation anymore, oh, there's no racism anymore. The second factor was that COVID exposed Americans of color as disproportionately filling the ranks of essential workers, the ranks of the unemployed, and the dead. So it really exposed how this inequality was a racial inequality. The polls showed that some 23 million people participated in anti-police brutality protest during the lockdown under the hashtag Black Lives Matter, well, hashtag. So if you go to the CCS YouTube channel and look at the Black Lives Matter special webinar series, you'll see that there was a seminar by Marjan Sida, who is a community activist. He's been an organizer, community activist, grassroots activist now for many years. And he was arguing that the Trump administration has actually been better for the movement for Black lives and racial justice than the Obama administration, because of the way in which the Trump presidency, I suppose, highlighted racial injustice and police brutality. So I thought that was quite an interesting comment. Do go and listen to his webinar when you have a chance. So the Black Lives Matter movement reverberated across the globe, resulting in transnational mobilizations and solidarity. So because of what was happening in the States, we saw protests happening all over the world, right? It spread to the UK, the Canadians were protesting. Everybody was in solidarity with this movement for racial justice. This occurred in two ways, networks. So BLM is linked and affiliated with a myriad of organizations and movements for Black lives. You know, a lot of these organizations have been in operation for decades. A lot of these organizations have been doing the important groundwork, foundational work that allowed 2020 to be the moment in history that it was. There wasn't suddenly an explosion and activism and organization around racial justice. This has been going on well since the civil rights movement. It's never ended, right? It's taken many forms. So the emphasis of these networks was on building power through communities and neighborhoods. And the Marjan Sida webinar talks about how this was done with the neighborhood solidarity and what the relevance is of building a sort of bottom-up organic activist neighborhood, as opposed to having an organization such as BLM, where only the sort of leadership or is in profile, or it's fashionable on Instagram for a while, but the real and genuine work is done at community and neighborhood level. And he spoke quite a bit about how this is done and how his organization has been doing that, and its sort of affiliation in the way that it worked under the arch of the Black Lives Matter movement in 2020. This also occurred through social media. So that was another reason why it was such an event in 2020, I suppose, because people were stuck at home and their form of connection to the outside world was social media. It was things on Zoom, etc. So Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, it's a hashtag movement. Social media also allowed the movement to frame its issues via hashtags. In this sense, it constructed meaning around its cause through social media. And what began as a movement for racial justice has evolved to pressing for change on legislation related to gay and transgender rights, for example. Also, BLM affiliates are working in political spaces. So Black Visions, for example, which is a Black Lives Matter affiliation, is working to build independent Black political power. So it utilized a number of hashtags. You would have seen, for example, I Can't Breathe, hashtag Black Lives Matter, obviously. Various ways in which it framed its cause for racial justice, for not wanting to put up with it any longer, and for advocating for change, right? So the Black Lives Matter movement has been linked to the American civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. So it's a significant moment in history, 2020, during the pandemic, during the lockdowns. So like the civil rights movement, though, there's been what Maria Martin calls the erasure of Black women. So the idea is, if you look at the campaigns of the American civil rights movement, a single charismatic male leader is the focus of the movement. And Maria Martin, she also has a webinar on the special series. You can find her webinar on the YouTube channel. So she was arguing that the same sort of thing has just been reproduced again under the Black Lives Matter movement. Political violence is framed around the endangerment of Black men. The plight of Black women is silenced, despite clear evidence of gendered police violence and criminalization of poor Black women. So this has resulted in this hashtag say her name, mention women's names. Women have been at the hands of police brutality as much as men, but for some reason, when it's highlighted or when attention is drawn to it, it seems to be the plight of Black men, but it isn't. So what accounts for this erasure of women, not just in hashtag Black Lives Matter, but in movements for racial justice, movements for social justice throughout history? So that's an interesting aspect of looking at Black Lives Matter and how those who are advocating hashtag Black Lives Matter are relating to gender, right? So finally, what have been some of the outcomes of the 2020 Black Lives Matter organizing campaigns? The hashtag that has traveled far and wide, the hashtag that has resulted in protests and solidarity campaigns across the world, across the globe. Well, I think that there've been some significant outcomes. So for example, the definition of racism, redefining racism to include structural racism. So there's actually been an adjustment of the way that dictionary defines racism. So, if you have that friend who says things like, we all have friends like that who say things like, oh no, I'm not a racist, I have like 7 Black friends. Well, that sort of thing isn't going to cut it anymore, because that's not what racism is a reference to. Racism is a reference to systemic forms of racism, the way systems and structures are set up to promote a certain race, to defend a certain race, to promote a certain race as more valuable than another. So that this definition is really forcing everybody to understand racism once and for all, because many people don't understand it. You see it in the way people say things like, well, white lives also matter. Yes, of course. But the point that we're making here is that there's been decades and generations invested in this idea of white supremacy. And so we need to begin the process of reversing that. I mean, this process has been happening all these decades. It certainly didn't just start in 2020. Okay, another one, dismantling institutions of oppression. So an example here are the various calls by the movements for Black lives in the States, especially during 2020, to defund the police. So these calls have been going on now for a number of years, but it's really in 2020 that they had actually become debated in policy circles. So at local government level, for example, mayors had started talking about defunding the police. So you know, if you look at, I think that in your readings, I've included a link to the Trevor Noah discussions where he talks to folks who have been working, abolitionists, right? People who have been working on these debates around defunding the police. And, you know, some of them will tell you, we're not saying abolish police totally, even though some are saying that we need to abolish police totally. But they are arguing why would the police be in charge, for example, of homelessness? Or why would the police be in charge of people who have abused drugs? So why are we giving police these sorts of powers when there are other ways that these socioeconomic problems can be dealt with, especially since these socioeconomic problems are prevalent in certain race groups, right? So why do we have the police policing them? So there are various levels of defunding the police and various debates around defunding the police. If you look in the YouTube channel, you'll see Hamid Khan's presentation, Stop LA PD Spying Coalition. That was a really interesting webinar on you know how police systems are set up to work, and so how they are set up to be racist, right? So go and listen to that if that theme interests you. Transforming cultural spaces. So here, if you think about all the statues that fell, okay, so in South Africa, we're familiar with the Rhodes Must Fall campaign movement and the Rhodes statue at UCT. But during the lockdown and under the hashtag of Black Lives Matter, there was this massive falling of Confederate statues. So people were asking questions such as, why are we honoring these people, right? These people who were slave owners or supported legislation around slavery. Why are they still in public spaces which we occupy? So surely we have a right to what's in those public spaces, and why would we want to glorify these sorts of figures from history? Sure, we're not saying that we can change history by removing them, but we're asking why they have these prestigious spaces, or they are, you know, why should I have to walk past the statue every day knowing what this person believed in and what this person voted? Okay, so in 2020, a lot of these statues fell. It wasn't just in the States, it was also in the UK. It kind of just spread like wildfire. But it was fascinating to see how it happened during the lockdown. Leanne Naidu's seminar on Statues Must Fall is also on the YouTube channel. If that interests you, have a look at that. Another interesting thing has been responses from the private sector. So there were responses that, you know, were really quite unexpected, that last year this time you would never have dreamed of, right? So for example, magazine editors came out and said, Anna Wintour, who's the editor of Vogue magazine, right? That's a very elite space, Vogue magazine. You have to be so connected to even get a job there, right? She came out and said that she regrets not giving enough space to Black editors and promoting their worldviews or their ideas of fashion. So, you know, for someone like her to come out and say something. Also, other sort of corporate sector, for example, Nike, featured the football player Colin Kaepernick. So Colin Kaepernick is the one who kneeled during the playing of the national anthem, and he was kneeling in protest to the treatment of Black people. And this was something that was not supported by the NFL. But Nike came out with this kneeling campaign in support of it, right? So yes, is that just brand activism? You know, is that going to lead to some kind of genuine change? Because we know people like sports brands like Nike, people like Anna Wintour have influence, right? So if they're going to genuinely change the way that they do things, or if they come out in support of certain things, it's going to reverberate through their sector. But is it just brand activism? It's a critique you might want to apply. I think that would be a fascinating op-ed. Reparations debate. So it's kind of refreshed the Black Lives Matter movement of 2020, has refreshed this talk of reparations for slavery. There is in fact a Senate bill in California that's bouncing around about reparations, but it's certainly been a year to discuss things such as reparations. And okay, so those are just some themes. I mean, there are many more themes. There were many more discussions and debates. All sorts of things happened in 2020 around the hashtag Black Lives Matter and the way that it reverberated in different places, and the things that different people were choosing to highlight and to apply to their own context. So this list I've got under outcomes are just some ideas that I think you may, hopefully one of them has, you know, drawn your attention, or that you're most interested in for you to structure your op-ed around. So that's the reason that I highlighted those, but there are many more. And there are, you know, we also discuss these on the CCS webinars. So there's plenty for you to go and listen to it. And it's also maybe quite nice that you can actually listen to something or watch something like the Trevor Noah thing, rather than always doing reading from academic journals. So I'm hoping that this session is a little bit different in that respect. Also, I know that you are the social media generation, so I'm sure you would have come across things on Instagram, on Facebook, on Twitter that really made you think about this movement and what it means in the world today, what it means for racial justice. What sort of culmination is it for all these decades working for equality amongst races? And in the context of COVID-19, is it this year that change is going to happen? What are the prospects for change? What could be the outcomes? What have the outcomes been already?